Hey everybody, my name is Wade Baker. I'm really glad to be speaking with you today at this fair con. Really glad that we were able to pull this off. Just a quick few things about me. I am a partner and co-founder at the Cyentia Institute. I'll be talking to you today about some of the research we've been doing related to cyber risk management. I am also a professor in the College of Business at Virginia Tech and teach some cybersecurity management courses there as well. I have a fairly long history with the FAIR Institute. I'm on the board of advisors and have been for a few years now. So try to keep tabs with the developments in both FAIR itself and the community, growing community, I'll add, around it in those activities. So I'm really looking forward to this. I'm going to share my screen now, and we'll go ahead and jump into what I have to share with you today. So the title of this talk, how better data can help make better decisions. And this is, I'll admit, kind of a go-to topic of mine. For many years now, I have been kind of on a personal and professional quest for better data to drive decision making. And that honestly goes back to when I was working on my PhD. I sent off a ton of emails to security companies and said, I want to do my dissertation on cyber risk management. I need some data. Will you please give me data for my dissertation? And one person responded. That person was Peter Tippett from TrueSecure. And he had a project that he wanted me to work on, happened to line up perfectly. And through the years, that led to eventually that work being published as Verizon's Data Breach Investigations Report in 2008. And I led that team for a while. And then now continue to study security data and tell stories around it. So like I said, I really like this topic. And I'm definitely much more on the gathering data that I hope is useful to decision makers like yourself. It's been a while since I've been on the decision making side of things. So what I thought I would do today is share a few things that we've been working on at the Cyentia Institute. So if you don't know, Cyentia is a research firm. Generally, we work with security vendors who come to us and they say, hey, we have an interesting data set on whatever it is, vulnerability management or third-party risk or application security, some examples that you see on the screen there. And they say, we would like to publish findings from this data because we think that'll drive thought leadership and things like that. Of course, we look at that as an opportunity to learn from the data and see what we can share with the community that informs risk management. And that's kind of what I would like to show you today. I set this out as a challenge. I've never done this before, but I set it out as a challenge to see if the research that we've published over the last few years at Cyentia, I can check off every single FAIR factor in the model that you see. Most of you, I'm sure, are fairly familiar with what's on the screen now. So I'm not going to spend my time explaining all of these things. Probably other talks and certainly information at the FAIR Institute about exactly what these things are, if you want more info. But like I said, this is a quest to see if we can find data that informs every single one of these things that you would need to assess if you were doing a FAIR-based risk assessment. All right, so let's kick this off with loss event frequency. This is the frequency of adverse incidents, loss events, things that lead to loss. So we did a study called the Information Risk Insights Study earlier in 2020, and we call it the IRIS. And on the left side over here, you see the percent of the Fortune 1000 firms that have known security breaches, loss events per year. And overall, it's about a quarter. You know, it ebbs and flows, but generally about a quarter of the Fortune 1000 have a loss event, at least one loss event in any given year. Now you might say, well, this is frequency. What if they have more than one? And that's the chart on the other side. If you look at Fortune 1000 firms, or kind of splits up into size tiers. So the top 250 are much more likely to have incidents, and it kind of drops off, right? Between there's almost a 1 in 2 chance, 50% chance of having one incident, and about a 1 in 10 chance of that size firm having 10 loss events or more in a year. And if you go down to the bottom of the Fortune 1000, they start off with about a 1 in 10 chance. And by the time you look at the probability of them having 10 or more loss events, you're looking at more like 1 in 100. So you're probably asking, well, I'm not in the Fortune 1000. What does my loss event frequency look like? And there's good news. You can check out this report, and it breaks it down by lots of different industries and lots of different size groups, all the way down to very small organizations, which, as you can imagine, that loss event frequency continues to drop. All right, so moving on, we have threat event frequency, and got to be honest, had to cheat a little bit on this one. Oddly as it sounds, I feel like threat event frequency, a number of attacks or attempts to access information assets and other things like that, I feel like that's sort of table stakes in security data. Lots of people have web application, IPS or firewall type counts, right? We just so happens haven't worked or published information on that topic. However, because of that, there is something called the Cyentia library out there. So if you go to the link in the slide here, we have brought together, it's over 2,500 documents, security industry documents on lots of different topics. And the reason we've done this is so that you can find things like this. So I just chose, I'm interested in threat event frequency of DDoS attacks. I type that in the search key, as you see on the slide, and up pop these results. So in the Cyentia library, there's a long list of reports that in some way have information on DDoS attacks, many of which will boil down to threat event frequency. So if you ever need a resource like that, there's lots of topics and tags in the library, and we plan to keep growing this and making it more and more useful. And it's totally free, by the way. I'm not pitching any kind of product. So that's my check off the box for threat event frequency. I want to go down a level now into a subcomponent of event frequency, or contact frequency. This is how often threat actors, various threat actors you're interested in will come in contact with your organization. And this one's a little bit odd. I hope the fair powers that be will accept my submission for contact frequency. So we published a report called Ripples Across the Risk Surface with Risk Recon as our partner. And we focused on this notion that incidents don't happen in isolation, hence the ripple events. So if you're familiar with the American Medical Collections Agency, they had a breach, and lots of other organizations were impacted by that breach. And the more connected our information assets become, and the more connected our business processes and information flows and money flows and all of that, when one organization has an incident, the chance that other organizations come into contact with or are negatively impacted by those events grows and grows and grows. And so there's a few numbers that I think are interesting when you start to think about this. Now, I'm thinking of an adversary, of a business partner of mine taking some action or having an incident that causes me to have a potential loss event. So that's what I mean by the contact frequency. And this chart shows that since we started measuring several years ago, this data set comes from Advisen. They have a large loss event data set that is available for purchase, but we use it for our research. The frequency of these ripple events is increasing. Now, I'm not going to get into the gray bars, but those are our projections, because it takes a while for these events to enter the data set and for the events themselves to propagate outward. So we think that is increasing. probably even more interesting is the downstream impacts of those. So that orange bar is now transposed to the top of the larger chart you see there, and it's barely perceptible because the downstream organizations, the ones that are impacted by those multi-party incidents, are far, far more numerous than the AMCAs of the world. Like the chart that I showed previously, 28 organizations impacted with known loss events from AMCA's breach, business partners of theirs. And this is also becoming more frequent, is the moral of the story. Now, if you're wondering, who am I most likely to come into contact with for these type of ripple events, there's kind of a live data visualization you can check out on the link there on this slide. But it essentially shows that, for instance, finance generates incidents for business support organizations received incidents from the finance sector. Business support gave, and this is just a big matrix. It looks like a mess, but that's because the environment that we do business in is a mess, and their incidents are passing back and forth. So, if you're a transportation organization over here, and you might want to look at this, who am I most likely to receive incidents from? That might be a bad example because it's so tiny, but you can trace these, the passing or the contact of different organizations for these ripple events. All right, probability of action is the other subcomponent of threat event frequency. For this, I'm using something called the Exploit Prediction Scoring System, EPSS. And in a nutshell, this is a project we worked on with Kenna Security and several other organizations contributing data to predict the probability of a vulnerability being exploited. That is why I associate this with probability of action. What is the probability that a threat actor will exploit a given vulnerability? And you can go to this calculator and you can check off things like it's a Microsoft vulnerability, there's a proof of concept available, it enables arbitrary code execution, and it's exploitable via remote access. And we predict a probability of 19.2% that it will be exploited within the next 12 months. And when we say exploited, that means exploited in the wild. All right. And the really cool thing is if I change one value, now all of a sudden we get information that there's a weaponized exploit available. Well, the probability jumps a huge amount to now it's 63.6% likely that vulnerability will be exploited in the next 12 months. So this is one of the things with so many vulnerabilities coming out, lots of them having logos and interesting names. It's easy to get distracted and chase things that aren't actually an issue because they're never exploited. So this is a good way to figure out the likelihood of any vulnerability that you're interested in being exploited based on its characteristics that it has. In this model, there's an entire paper behind it. You can find all of that information at the link on this slide if you're interested. Okay, done with threat stuff. Let's move to vulnerability. For vulnerability overall, we actually have a lot of research in vulnerability on the topic of vulnerability. And so I just chose this. This comes from the State of Software Security from Veracode. This is volume 10. For the last few years, we've been working with Veracode on this chart, but this is one of the longer running reports in the industry. So there's some pretty cool 10-year trends in this as well. But the one I chose here is just to give the sense that vulnerability in software is very, very, very widespread and very, very, very hard to get rid of. So this report looks at the proportion of applications that have flaws and how fast they're fixed and all of these kinds of things. But the culmination of this particular volume was this. I mean, it kind of looks like an iceberg on purpose because of all the vulnerabilities in applications, there's a fairly small proportion of them that are getting fixed over time. And you have this growing problem of security debt, what lies below the surface there of flaws that stick around for a long time. And this is essentially the problem we've been dealing with in security for a very long time now. And there are ways to improve this, by the way. We looked at things that can be done to change the shape of this vulnerability debt, and it can be done. Things like faster scanning and fixing, not waiting until you're done developing the application and then try to fix all the flaws before you release it. But doing that in batches frequently during the development process is one example of a way that dramatically changes the shape of that debt underneath there. So vulnerability. Underneath vulnerability, there is resistance strength, and that's one I'll go into next. Now, this is one of my favorite charts from all of our research, and I remember when this popped out, and Jay Jacobs, if you know him, was behind this one. We both were just amazed at the story that it told. So what we did was we got, this comes from Kenna, by the way. There's a series of reports, prioritization to prediction, and this is from volume 5. Actually, this first appeared in volume 3, but it's repeated in volume 5. So if you want to catch up there, you can. But we took vulnerabilities from hundreds of organizations, and we asked the question, on average, how many vulnerabilities do they detect across their environment? And you can see that some of them have 1,000, some of them have 10, near 100 million. So wide variation in terms of the number of vulnerabilities in an environment. No shocker there. But we also looked at and asked the question, on average, how many of those vulnerabilities are closed, patched, fixed, in some way remediated? And that also is a wide variation. But the astounding thing here is that if you look at this ratio of open to closed vulnerabilities, it's about 1 in 10, no matter how large the environment is. So if you have 1,000 vulnerabilities in your environment, you close about 100. If you have 100,000, you close about 10,000. If you have 10 million vulnerabilities in your environment, you're closing about 1 million. And there's variation there. Some organizations do better than that 1 in 10. Some organizations do worse than that 1 in 10. But the story here is that when you look at vulnerability and you try to think, what's the resistance strength? It might be lower than you expect because the typical organization is only fixing 1 in 10 of the vulnerabilities that exist in their environment. And that reduces resistance strength, right? If you want to maximize resistance strength, you drive that vulnerability closure up and you increase the resistance strength across your environment and, of course, for particular systems. Now, I want to jump out of resistance strength for a minute. We're going to go back there in a second. And I want to talk about threat capability, all right? This is another subcomponent of vulnerability. This asks the question, how capable are adversaries to pull off various exploits or infiltrate my systems or successfully compromise my defenses? And what we want to do is kind of match up threat capability and resistance strength, and that informs vulnerability, of course. So for threat capability, I chose to go back to this notion of exploiting vulnerabilities. And what you see on this chart, first of all, is again, hundreds of organizations, millions of vulnerabilities, large and small environments. And let's just look at the vertical. About 2/3 of vulnerabilities have never been observed across those hundreds of organizations that we looked at. So there's lots and lots of vulnerabilities that are known to exist, that have been published, that have a CVE, if you're familiar with that, but lots of known vulnerabilities in the world. This data shows that the majority of them, 2/3, we did not observe them in a corporate environment among the several hundred organizations that we studied. Doesn't mean they don't exist. It just means that they're probably fairly low level, not prevalent, and kind of obscure software. So let's focus on the side where these vulnerabilities have been observed in a real environment. And then let's segment it horizontally. And when we do that, we're making a distinction between those vulnerabilities that have known exploits versus those with no known exploits, right? If you think of an exploit, the adversary now has the capability to exploit that and use it in some type of malicious activity, right? If you have a system facing the internet and all of a sudden there's a weaponized exploit for that, the chance of that coming into the attacker's radar skyrockets, because when there's an exploit, it gets wrapped into Metasploit and all kinds of other tools that both blue teamers and malicious adversaries use, and it's going to it ups their capability, makes their cost of attack a lot less. You see attacks go up in frequency, so on and so forth. So anyway, what this is telling you is that there's a fairly small subset of all published vulnerabilities that have both been observed in the live environment and have known exploits, 5%. So that is actually pretty cool. I mean, it's not cool that adversaries have the capability to very easily exploit 5% of all known vulnerabilities, but it's a whole lot better than them having the capability to exploit 100% of vulnerabilities, right? And so this notion of prioritizing, taking a risk-based approach to the way that you manage vulnerabilities becomes critically important. And so going back to resistance strength, you know, that 1 in 10 ratio I shared with you earlier, that's a fact. But I don't think that organizations have to remediate 100% of their vulnerabilities. The minimum they need to do to improve their resistance strength and lower the capability of threat actors exploiting their systems is to nail that 5%, right? That we need to make sure that these are taken care of in our environment, and we dramatically increase our resistance strength and reduce our vulnerability because of that. So this chart asks the question, are organizations doing that? When we say high-risk vulnerabilities, we mean those with known exploits, right? The threat actor has the capability to exploit those now. And the cool thing is that 51% of those organizations that we studied are actually reducing the number of known exploited vulnerabilities in their environment. That is to say, they're increasing resistance strength, they're reducing vulnerabilities, and they're reducing, I guess you could say they're reducing the capability of threat actors to at least compromise them. And then another are maintaining, you know, treading water. So you have 2/3 of organizations that are at least keeping up with the high-risk vulnerabilities in their environment. Now there's 33% that those are increasing over time. But again, there's things that you can do to improve this situation and increase your likelihood of being on the blue side over there. All right, so at this point, we've nailed everything under loss event frequency. So let's go to the impact side of the risk model, the loss side. Starting off with loss magnitude or primary loss magnitude. So from this, we're going back to the IRIS 2020. We published a chart. This looked at, again, the Advisen data set that has lots of loss events from known compromises. And when we plot those out, the question here is, what is the typical cyber security incident cost? You know, what's the loss? And notice that this is on a log scale, first of all. This losses are extremely heavy-tailed, but they're almost perfect. This is a normal distribution in log space, so it's, you know, losses are log normal if you're into modeling. But the median is about 200K, so is the geometric mean. The average, the arithmetic mean is 19 million, which this is such a skewed distribution, we wouldn't use that, but it's there for show. So if someone asks you, you know, what's the typical breach cost? I think a couple $100,000 is a reasonable answer. Now you saw that tail off to the right, but you can also say, hey, but there's a 10% chance it could be 100x or higher than that, kind of going to over 90% of breaches are less than 19 million, or $20 million if you want to round it off. So good stuff on loss magnitude there. I won't go too far into this, but if you've been in the security industry for a while and you've tried to do something with loss magnitude, you've probably heard of Ponemon's cost per record. They publish an amount every year. And this is from the 2019 cost of a data breach study from Ponemon, I believe. And the cost per record is that horizontal dashed line through the middle is 100 and something. I can't exactly remember what it is, but the thing is that study only accounts for that little window in the middle there. Anything outside of that, they say, is outside the scope of the study. $150 per record. It's labeled right there, and it's just a terrible model. We really go into detail about why you shouldn't use this in this report. Because as you can see, as those incidents get larger and larger, I mean, the cost per record shows a downward trend. It goes down pretty dramatically. And so if you just take $150 a record and multiply it by $100 million or 100 million data records, you're going to get an absurd value that's nowhere near what it is actually likely to cost you. So don't use a single cost per record metric. Not a good way to go. The IRIS offers this table if you want to use predict losses based on records. This table is a better way to go about it. So that $100 million loss that I mentioned a moment ago, there's a 99.5% chance that it'll be at least $10,000 in loss, and there's a 2% chance that it could be $1 billion loss. So there's wide ranges here, lots of uncertainty, but hey, that's the world we live in. And as long as you can put some numbers around that uncertainty, you can do something with it in the context of FAIR. So if you're trying to do that, check out the IRIS 2020. All right, so that takes care of primary loss. I want to finish off here with secondary loss or secondary risks. And this is a tough one. So we have some brand new research recently published that is a follow-up to the IRIS 2020, which we affectionately call the IRIS Extreme. And the idea here is we took extreme loss events, the top 10%-ish of losses in the data set that we studied, and we did a deep dive on about 100 of the largest cyber loss events over the last 5 years, all right? And those losses are plotted on the screen here, and you can see that all of a sudden, the median loss is 47 million instead of the 200K that I showed you a while ago. So obviously, these are larger events when that's the median. But of course, this is still primary loss. I just wanted to set the stage. It is not a full report all on secondary loss, but secondary loss does appear in this report. So for instance, on the screen, we tried to break down the losses of these extreme events into the forms of loss defined by FAIR: response cost, productivity or revenue loss, etc. And there's a few on there, fines and judgments. That was 18 or so of those 100 events. We had a known fine or judgment. I want to caveat that because to appear on this, we had to find a reasonable value for it. But it does inform, at least when you're looking at the different types of losses, which types are more or less common, and secondary losses like fine or judgments, how common are they? I will also mention, because we're talking secondary loss, that we didn't find any reputation damage or things like that. It's hard to quantify. We get into that in the report. If you are really interested, read it. But that would be another one that, if we had seen it, would be on this as a secondary loss event example. A couple others we looked into were, a lot of these organizations filed SEC 10Ks, 10Qs, and had to disclose that loss event to investors, which is a secondary actor. And public inquiry was involved in 23 of these incidents where it was a government investigation or something along those lines. Because of this massive incident, it triggered that for that. And again, that's a secondary actor that may cause loss for the organization. And there is secondary loss magnitude I meant to put on this chart, but those fines and judgments had a median value of 21 million, but noteworthy, they were also the largest loss. The largest loss we recorded was 5 billion, and that was one of the fines and judgments. So we did it. Everything is checked in the FAIR framework. I appreciate you joining me on this talk. I'm going to stop sharing here. And I would be glad to answer questions. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. I know I will. So thanks a lot for attending. And I hope you can find good data for better decisions. Thank you.